So now we're on. So I'll start to thank the Peterson Institute, of course, for hosting the seminar today, but certainly also the institutes headed by Rick and Ricardo. And thank you them for bringing the discussion so much progressed as we have it today with the report, not least. Of course, we believe this is an extremely important issue for the industry, certainly also for the climate dissemination strategy of the globe. I also have to say that local content, trade barriers are not new in the industry. We have seen them all through, I would say, in the development of these new technologies. And many of you would know that it's only 1 year ago that the Chinese backed down on their 70% local content requirement. But I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 to 3 years, we do have seen an increasing tendency in especially new markets for copy-pasting the not so good virtues of the past. And that, of course, is a great worry because the industry has changed very significantly from we used to have being a minority industry to what we have today being a major industry, a very growing industry, as we have seen in the numbers of today. I also think it's fair to say that the whole discussion here has not started out as an academic approach, but rather a bottom-up approach. It is market players like my company and certainly many other companies who are starting to worrying about this going on because it's going to deliver a lot of complexity in the market if we don't change it. And that's the reason why we don't have any specific interest in putting out the neck here. This is normally not something that commercial companies like to do for exposure reasons. But certainly a company like Vesta's, which happens to be a pioneer company in the wind industry, more than 30 years of experience, and the most international company, do feel obliged to raise some red flags as we see the trends in the industry here. And I think against that background, that was really the reason why we some years ago started to discuss that more openly with like-minded people and with knowledgeable people like Gary Hofbauer and other peoples in the Global Agenda Council context. And we are so pleased that we have come to this level here. Certainly there's still a lot of things to do before we will be at any stage where you can call it a progressment of the situation. But as with all things, I think we need to realize and recognize the problem before you can deal with it. So with these general remarks here, I will start by highlighting the great drivers of bringing this to a success. Certainly starting with the classical free trade argument that more liberalization certainly is a jobs stimulator, but certainly this also links very heavily into what we're dealing with in other policy contexts like the climate talks globally. And here we happen to be of the opinion that the technology solution is going to be the major contribution for dealing with climate change. And therefore, if we start a secondary track here where we are seeing a renationalization of technologies, certainly we're not going to deliver anything on climate mitigation going forward. And thirdly, but not lastly, this also links heavily into the ambition and trend of this industry of bringing down the cost of energy for renewables, which is also a very strong political requirement, I would like to say. We see politicians in more and more markets demand that these technologies need to get out the subsidies and needs to be viable without any public support going forward. And therefore, we do feel obliged to be able to deliver that from the industry side. But here we need the scale, and here we need the global market. The industry, as you can see in this graph, has developed very rapidly. Here are some columns showing the market development in 2004, 2007, and 2010. And as you can see, rapid growth rates, also increasing development in emerging markets over the years. And with success, of course, come a lot of interest. And I have to say that a lot of the success so far has been because maybe we got under the radar. We were kind of recognized or being regarded as a component manufacturer's industry, and therefore the only trade irritant or barrier was a tariff barrier so far. But we have seen in recent years that this industry has become what you can call a strategic industry, and therefore we are getting more and more into the strategic connotations of the energy industry, which is not a very liberalized segment worldwide in many markets around the world. So, of course, we are pleased to see that we are getting up on the agenda, but the other side to the coin is certainly that people have strong political or industrial ambitions of playing a great role here. Question is whether that would be the right path for actually succeeding with that success or that position in their own market. And certainly not least Europe, it simply needed a greater globalized market, including North America and China. And because of having that possibility, it has been possible to drive the efficiency in the technology with the present platforms more than 100 times. And with the new products being announced to market, which is equivalent to a 7 megawatt or 7,000 kilowatt turbine, there are more to come here in coming years, but certainly provided that you do have the scale to bring in that kind of investment. The other point about cost of energy and the reductions in the industry I want to highlight here is very clear from this graph here, which is showing the decline or the reduction of cost of energy in PV solar. You can also see that wind, onshore wind, is very close to be competitive with natural gas in the US. These are numbers from the US market. You don't see a lot of learning curve in the wind figures here, but if we have included perspective further backwards, of course you have seen a similar trend of the learning curve and the reduction of cost of energy here. But I think this is a very strong driver why a SETA makes sense. There's a lot of gains for societies all around the world to be able to deliver what you could call grid parity or parity competitive technologies going forward. What we have seen in recent years certainly is that both the more classical instruments of market barriers or hindering is used progressively, and here we have highlighted a few of them, and you can see that we are talking about relatively elevated tariff levels in some of these markets here. So certainly there are some things to come for and to reduce. This is of course playing by the book, so no worries about that, but certainly something that is hindering imports into those markets. What might be more worrying really is the non-tariff barriers, which we have seen growing quite heavily, I would say, over the last 2-3 years. And almost every market are having kinds of what you can call national favorism, local content, binational, or other kind of tariff barriers. But the landscape, the roadmap here looks, as you can see, that more and more markets are using this, and that's the reason why we, from the industry side, are raising the flag here. We don't want, of course, to point fingers at anyone or highlight anyone in particular, but there are some well-known cases that have also been alerted to during the discussion this morning. We are having a dispute settlement case going on in terms of Japan against Canada on Ontario Green Act. We're also seeing that local content is being applied even in Europe, but certainly also in the outer area of Europe, like Turkey. South Africa is applying it. A lot of new markets are using this. So from the industry side, we are very eager to see a resolution of the panel case in order to get clarity in the industry of what is legal and what is not legal. The sooner, the better, simply for that kind of resolution. The local content requirements certainly might be effective in driving a few manufacturing jobs, but it certainly also has some downsides. Clearly, it limits competition. It increases the cost in the projects. We have some calculations from Ontario of between 20 to 25% of cost increases in the tenderings. It also makes it more difficult to come in a given market with a very broad offering, because you need to have the product line established. Normally that would only apply to one product line, if at all, in a given market. So you cannot bring in the total offering in such a given market. It is also negative in the sense that it is a kind of artificial stimulation of the market, as we have seen in China these days. A lot of overcapacity in the Chinese market, so I bet they are eager to get international or go international in coming years, because the oversupply they have been generating with that kind of policies is simply amazing. And seen from maybe a developing country perspective, it is not many years ago, it's not more than 2.5 years ago that my industry was not doing much in emerging markets or even developing countries. Why? Well, for that simple reason that there was so much speed on the supply chain in mature markets that there was simply no appetite for going to developing countries. Developing countries normally are regarded as markets with higher project risks and therefore also more costly ventures, I would say, both for the investors and the suppliers. Putting in, blunt local content requirement in an emerging market might actually have the consequence that no technology will find its way to that country or that market. And certainly it has a negative cost impact to the consumers that one needs to be absolutely clear about. And I think the irony of all this, seen again from an industry perspective, is that why do it? What we are showing you in this slide here is a value chain or supply chain, you could say, from a wind manufacturer. And as you can see, a lot of the value chain does actually have a lot of offering which will generate a lot of local jobs and investments. So this arbitrary focus on getting this local blade manufacturing line in the country might actually at the end be a very bad investment in the end, because there's a lot of local jobs in the building of the plant, in the planning of the plant, in the installation, in the maintenance of the plant. And the maintenance job, they will be jobs for the whole life cycle, or whole lifetime of the investment, meaning 20 years. And those jobs will also be jobs close to the plant, meaning out in rural areas, out at the countryside, where technicians and service managers can be close to the turbines to service them. So I think we need to be better at communicating that renewables in most cases are actually creating, and here I can only be speaking about the wind technology at this point of time, but is actually creating a lot of local jobs anyhow. So why this arbitrary focus on also getting the full supply chain localized? That, of course, is nice to have that, and a company like ours are doing quite a lot, I would say. We are doing manufacturing in 9 different countries, different part of the turbine in markets also, so that and sometimes are many factories actually in one market. But of course, what we are really evaluating before doing so is this a market having critical mass? Is this a market where we can see the stability in the market? Is here renewable energy part of the energy policy going forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years? These are things that industry will evaluate in order to make that kind of supply chain investment, certainly. So rather than focus on regulatory limitations, one should be focusing on attracting it the positive way, giving the transparency in the market, the commitment, and then private investments will follow. That tells history. So again, just to sum it up, I think I made the points here very clear. We don't need local content for many reasons. Cost of energy may be one of the most important ones if I can judge the political discussion these days. Also in terms of what this technology needs to develop, because there are still learning curve achievements going forward. So we need the global market. And I always like to show my iPhone at situations like this, because this is really the goal for this industry. I mean, and that's the reason why we started to see, could we not try and replicate the success of the ITA in the green industry? Because the IT sector has come far, has been very successful. I fully realize your remark, Gary, that you cannot compare the two situations, but still, if we are judging the world trade of wind power so far, it is still for more than 90% only North America, Europe, and China, and Australia, and India. That's what it is, and I think that the number will be 95%, covering those markets and those countries. So maybe we're not too late, but certainly time is ticking here. The longer we wait, the more comprehensive we want, the more perfect we want to be, we're never gonna make it. And therefore I fully echo the views of Gary, that rather go simplistic, go small list, but faster, because speed is of essence here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's extraordinarily good timing to be having this conversation in the solar industry right now. I think when I got the invitation to speak in the first place, we were something like 20 days PS, or post-Cylindro, which is how I think of the world now. But before the trade petition had been filed, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that makes it a particularly important time to be talking about trade issues in solar, particularly in the US. So I view my role here as providing a bit of context and sort of setting the landscape for what's been going on in the solar industry, both globally and then specifically within the US, because first of all, it's a contentious topic right now, and second, it relates to today's forum. Just a little bit about us, and not too much of a sales pitch. GTM Research is a market analysis and consulting firm. We focus in, I guess my slides are a little excitable here. We focus in clean tech broadly, but our two big areas of focus are solar and smart grid technologies, and I lead the solar team. Within solar, we cover the entire global landscape, everything from manufacturing of equipment and feedstock down to demand and project finance globally. But we do have a particular focus in the US market, both because we're based here and we understand it well, but also because it's a lot more complex than most markets are, at least for solar globally, particularly in the sense that everything in the US is driven at the state level. So you have 50 different state markets, or really more like 3,000 utility markets, in contrast to, say, Germany, where it's really one national market. So first, a bit of global history that will lead us to where we stand today. Looking at installations for PV over the past 10 years or so, There have been a number of markets that have led the pack in any given year. It started out with Japan through 2004. Germany overtook Japan and then was leading the world until 2008. Spain had this one-year boom in 2008 when it installed about 2.5 gigawatts, which is more than was installed globally the previous year. That was unintended by the Spanish government, so they pulled back on their feed-in tariff, and Germany picked up again. And then in 2010, it was Germany and you could say Italy joined. I think the most important defining characteristic of global PV markets for the past 10 years has been that in every year, there has been a single market of last resort, or a savior market. There's been one market that, even if there was a time of trouble when it looked like we would hit oversupply in the market, we had one market that ramped up far more than was expected at the beginning of the year and essentially saved the market. So we never really had overcapacity for an entire year through 2010. Spain did it in 2008. In 2009, we had the financial crisis and Spain disappeared as a market. And so it looked like it would happen, but then Germany picked up. And in 2010, we had a bunch of new manufacturing capacity, but fortunately, Germany continued to grow, and then Italy picked up. So we've had actually kind of a charmed history for solar manufacturers. The other overarching trend in terms of the past 10 years in solar on the manufacturing side is the growth of China. If you look back further, back when solar panels were first being manufactured in the 70s, the US was the leader, and then Japan picked up very quickly. And so for a long time, the leading manufacturers of solar panels were the companies that manufacture your television or your car. This was Sanyo, Sharp, Kyocera, Mitsubishi, and they led for a while. And then Germany picked up as an end market and manufacturing followed. So you had a bunch of German manufacturers who were leading the pack. But right around 2005, 2006, China started ramping up its manufacturing of solar panels, and since then has taken over the market to the extent that today well over half of all global manufacturing of cells and modules takes place in China. And that number is only growing by the day. So that brings us up to 2010. 2011 has been a drastically different story, and I think Ethan did a really good job of setting the stage there, so maybe I'll just try to dive into it a bit deeper. First of all, what we had from 2010 to 2011 was a ton of capacity growth. And actually, I need to update these numbers. We just added a couple more new facilities. They're going to be online by the end of the year. So in reality, it looks like panel manufacturing capacity by the end of 2011 will be up more like 55% year over year. At the same time, there was an expectation that demand would follow the same trend, but didn't, because the two leading markets, Germany and Italy, both had down years, and both were expected to pick up later in the year, and neither have. So it's been a really bad demand picture, and for the first time in recent history, we don't have another market that's turning into the market of last resort. There is no market with an uncapped feed-in tariff with outsized project returns like we had in Germany and Spain and Italy that enabled the kind of growth that we had seen over the course of 1 year in one market. And that means that the landscape hasn't gotten any better, and the supply-demand imbalance has gotten worse. And that's what's led to this massive overcapacity that has led panel prices to drop somewhere on the order of 40% already this year, from about $1.80 down to around $1.10, as Ethan said. And that's a moving target. Every day, prices continue to drop because demand still isn't picking up. So it's been an extraordinarily difficult year for solar manufacturers globally, and every manufacturer's margins have taken a big hit. But it's been particularly difficult for companies that, one, are not cost competitive, two, are trying to commercialize new technologies and trying to scale up their manufacturing or optimize their process to the point where they actually are competitive with the incumbents. And three, those that don't have a big balance sheet behind them that allows them to burn cash while they lose money and scale up. And there are a bunch of companies that fit into these buckets, and these are the ones that are having the hardest time right now. So looking at that from a US perspective, what has happened over the course of this year, it's been, just in the past 2 months, it's been a pretty momentous time in the US solar industry. We've had 3 bankruptcies of US solar manufacturers this year. Solyndra is obviously the biggest and caused the biggest reaction. I think Solyndra is a household name now, which is really unfortunate for the solar industry. We've also had 2 additional manufacturing plants that have closed so far this year. And then, this big media reaction primarily to Solyndra that I won't get into in a lot of detail, but it has elevated solar and to a sort of new stage in the political landscape, and obviously has political ramifications that are being dealt with now. And then most recently, and it sounds like everyone in this room is pretty familiar with it, but most recently we have now a petition that was filed by SolarWorld, which is a German solar manufacturer with a big facility in Oregon, and 6 other unnamed companies. That is an anti-dumping countervailing duty petition requesting import duties on Chinese cells and modules. They're asking for 100% import duty. Anyone who's familiar with the process knows that what they request doesn't actually impact what they'll get. But if you look at the historical record of these types of petitions, and if you look at sort of the case at hand, the chances are relatively good that you could end up with import duties on Chinese panels. And that would have a drastic impact on the U.S. market. And I'll talk a little bit about the market in a minute, but one point to make is that earlier this year, Chinese panels have been, they've been growing in market share for a while, but they surpassed 50% of all the installations in the U.S. now. So more than half of installations, at least towards the latter half of this year, use Chinese panels. So that's just a sense of what an impact this would have. But I would like to first point out that, and I think a couple of these have been mentioned already, but there, protectionism in solar, domestic content requirements, it's not brand new. It's not even new in the U.S. Just looking at a few examples here in the U.S., we've had a couple of smaller, probably less contentious domestic content policies here. It was in the stimulus package. It's now required for defense procurement, which is actually becoming a reasonably large market for solar. In Ontario, the feed-in tariff has a domestic content requirement, which is being challenged. In India, the National Solar Mission has a domestic content requirement, which initially was just for panels and now has been extended to cells for the second phase. And then in Italy's latest version of its feed-in tariff, there is a bonus for 60% made in the EU equipment, which it's taken a while to figure out exactly what that means. But so that's been going on in a few places. And then at the same time, and maybe this is a bit more controversial to say, but we also do have, and it's pretty well understood in the solar industry, de facto closed markets in China and to a lesser extent in Japan. You know, if you're not a Chinese panel manufacturer, you're probably not selling into the Chinese end market unless you have a JV with a Chinese company, you set up a manufacturing facility in China or something of the sort. In Japan, it's less true, but still, you see very few foreign manufacturers selling into the Japanese end market, which is an important end market. There's another point that I'd like to make generally about the solar industry, and this has a lot to do with what was discussed before about going narrow versus going broad. The solar industry is not as simple as, let's manufacture a solar panel, we'll do it in one location, and then we'll install it. There's actually a lot more to it. The traditional crystal and silicon manufacturing process is, depending on how you look at it, 4 or 5 steps. And oftentimes those steps take place in different locations. And so you do have manufacturing facilities that sit earlier in the value chain that often aren't discussed in whether it's trade discussions or anything. People see panels or even cells and they get that, but they don't recognize that, for example, feedstock production, polysilicon production is a really important part of the solar industry. It's often not considered. And that's particularly relevant to the US because the US is a world-leading manufacturer of polysilicon. In addition, there are other elements that you could consider outside of the panel. With solar, you have to convert the DC electricity generated by the sun into the AC electricity on the grid, and so you have power electronics or inverters that do that for you. That's a solar product that requires manufacturing as well, and it's another place where the US does pretty well. So I think the overall view on US manufacturing for solar now, if you take the whole thing into account, is that it's been difficult. And certainly the trend is not towards the US gaining share in manufacturing in any of these sectors. But we do still have about 50 active manufacturing facilities across the value chain in the US, spread out across around, I think it's 22 states. And that relates to trade flows. We did an analysis for the second time earlier this year that was commissioned by the Solar Energy Industries Association. in the US that was intended to take a comprehensive look at solar trade flows in and out of the US. And perhaps surprisingly, we found that the US was, at least in 2010, which is the last data set we used, a net exporter of solar products. In fact, we were actually a net exporter specifically to China as well, which is even more counterintuitive. And in essence, the reason for that is that in the US, we produce a lot of polysilicon feedstock and we produce a lot of capital equipment, which is the equipment and the tools used in the manufacturing of solar panels. So in essence, at its most simplistic, what you have is the US manufacturing feedstock and equipment, selling it primarily to China, which then turns it back into a panel, which is sold back to the US. So we do import a lot of modules or panels, but we manufacture things earlier in the value chain. Now, I should throw a caveat in here, which is that we haven't done the analysis yet for 2011, but it's entirely likely that the situation is going to change drastically. Because we have this global overcapacity, there's less capacity expansion, which means less purchasing of US equipment. At the same time, China is, and a few other countries as well, are growing their manufacturing base for polysilicon. And at the same time, the US market is growing, so we're importing a lot more panels. So this picture could change entirely. But I do think it's important to look at solar from a holistic view, as opposed to just looking at the cell or the module and assuming that that's the entire solar industry. Whether or not that's actually feasible to include in something like SETA is a completely different question, and I understand why that would be difficult. Polysilicon is a good example. It's also used in semiconductor manufacturing. So if you were to try to include it, you would have to parse out polysilicon for PV, which is what we did, but it's not an easy thing to do. The other point to make, which I think has been made before, is let's not forget about the end market. Historically, the US has been actually pretty consistently somewhere between 5 and 7% of global PV installations in any given year. The US market has been growing, but it's been growing more or less in tandem with the global market. And that's why if you looked at my initial slide that had the history of global PV markets, the US didn't even play in there. We were more of a bit player on a global scale. But I think by all accounts, in the sort of reference case, that's changing this year. We have a situation when the global market is slowing down in terms of new growth, but the US market is continuing to grow quite rapidly. The US market grew by about 102% in terms of installations last year, and we're forecasting about another 100% growth this year. Next year, it'll probably slow down some, but it could be something like 50, 60%. So the growth in the US is outpacing the global market, and that means that the US is becoming a much more important end market for solar. And what you had was a lot of solar companies, both investors, manufacturers, distributors, installers, that were setting up shop of some kind or another in the US, investing in the US market, and treating it as one of, if not the next big growth market. There is some argument to be made that if we do impose barriers to some of these companies, then their investment in the US could take a hit, and there's some danger there. And there's also some danger in terms of job growth in the downstream. We have installers in the US that are growing enormously fast. We have companies like Solar City, which doubled its workforce to, I think, over 1,000 people now in the past 12 months and is continuing to grow at that same rate. And these are jobs that rely on the growth of the end market. This is the final slide, and I like to put this up at the end of presentations about the US market particularly, which is these are the 10 largest individual power plants in the US by generating capacity. They're mostly nuclear or hydro. And that's as compared to, on the far right, cumulative PV installed operating on the grid right now. And for those of you who are going to catch me on it, this doesn't even incorporate capacity factors. So in fact, PV looks even worse if you incorporate that. And I looked the other day, and I could have actually expanded this out to 25 power plants. So in essence, what we've done thus far in terms of deployment in the US is built one relatively big power plant. And that says to me two things. One is we have a long way to go before we are a meaningful part of the electricity sector in the US. And two is there's enormous potential for deployment here before we even start to hit grid stability issues or anything that comes with increased deployment of intermittent resources. And so it is a really critical time when in the US we can, one, become an important global player in PV deployment, and two, we can actually make solar a meaningful part of the electricity portfolio here. And so I hope that through SETA and anything else that we can do, that is a big part of, at least from the US perspective, our end goal. Thank you.
Gary asked me to stick to 10 minutes, so this is going to be a very fast tour through biofuels and basically ethanol policy in the United States, with some interesting conclusions at the very end. And I'm not really as much of a business person as someone from trade land and trade policy land, so I'm more focused on, in particular, the politics of biofuels. Okay, so if you ran this as a critical mass negotiation in which you were trying to hit a critical mass for a given set of products, why would you do ethanol? Why? There is actually considerable skepticism about ethanol these days from the mitigation standpoint. Corn-based ethanol, if it's made in a coal-fired plant, really does not get you any benefit relative to burning fossil fuels. And some people say it's worse. That's based on a life cycle analysis, including the considerable consumption of fossil fuels in growing the corn, transporting it, making the ethanol, transporting the ethanol to market, and so forth. But supposing you had a standalone, you had a critical mass trade agreement like the ITA, you would have this set up as probably something where you would identify concessions by HS number and also by name. That would be very important, because what I saw in Gary's paper is that some of these items, for instance, biodiesel, can be reclassified by the Harmonized System Committee, and in some cases you have developing technology, as in the solar area. So this is a situation where you need to nail things down by name. Okay, sorry, that's a little stuff from someone who's been involved in the enforcement of the ITA concessions. So one of the volumes, I think from my perspective, one of the benefits of having a critical mass agreement is that you could administer it through the WTO. You use WTO dispute settlement. It's really low cost from that standpoint. So, and it's really enforceable. But, okay, the question is, would you get the critical mass? And why would you do biofuels? Partly for their own from their own merits as methods of mitigation, and partly because to sweeten the pot, frankly, for certain parties that trade in biofuels, and in particularly Brazil. And we'll hear more about that, I guess, from the following speaker. And what we've found actually in the ITA and in also collaborative agreements on semiconductors is that, in fact, the standard setting process that follows an agreement like this can be actually very useful, very useful way of cooperation. And the fact that if you have an agreement where only the parties can participate in making a voluntary standards process, that actually can be pretty sticky glue in getting people to join up. So if you think about an agreement like this, you have to think about what factors drive trade patterns. Obviously, in the ethanol case, and in the case of biofuels, input prices matter. For instance, in Brazil right now, the price of sugar is up. Farmers are, in fact, sending their sugar cane to sugar mills and not to ethanol factories. And in fact, there's a shortage of ethanol, and Brazil has turned into a net importer of ethanol. Go figure. But this is real. This is what's happening this year. That's one of the surprising facts of this presentation. You have demand driven by mandates, mandates such as the mandate in Brazil to have every car use some ethanol, the mandates in the US, mandates also elsewhere. Supply, infrastructure, exchange rates are not insignificant. That's another factor that's driven Brazil into being a net importer of biofuels. The exchange rate is up. Subsidies and tariffs we'll talk about. So to see the tariffs, these are based on the tariff tables in your paper, Gary. And what it shows you is that the bound rates are actually pretty significant. These are the MFN rates, of course, not the preferential rates. And although there are some parties in this group which have preferential agreements with each other, like the US, Australia, US, Korea, there are some which have basically, which don't, and which it would be very interesting dealing with that 597% tariff in South Africa. There's also, by the way, on page 40 of this book, a graph that shows the tariff rates. Here we have a picture of where world ethanol exports are last year. And there you have still Brazil, the king of the hill, but the US actually getting right up there. Europe, yes, and the rest of the world, but what we have here also is in the US ethanol trade balance over the last 6 years, in this complex market, which is linked to both oil prices, farm prices, and where you have lots and lots of intervention in the market, what you see is that the significant high US tariff on ethanol was not high enough to deter imports. And in 2010, 2011, suddenly, you have the US emerges as a big exporter with a positive trade balance with Brazil. Brazil, which in fact is where some of these imports are in fact being sucked in by the effect of past mandates. Brazil having built up an infrastructure by, in fact, substantial subsidies, which no longer exist now that the infrastructure is in place, and having built a market thanks to mandates, now has a vehicle fleet that demands ethanol. And if the cane sugar is going into sugar and not into ethanol, they're going to have to import ethanol. All very interesting. So what do we have in the US? Well, as you may be aware, we have something called the Renewable Fuel Standard. First enacted in 2005. This graph shows you the requirement as revised in 2007 at the federal level. This is a target for blending ethanol into gasoline. On overall, you have overall targets and you have sub-targets for cellulosic ethanol that is not based on corn, but which is based on more renewable type biomass like switchgrass. The important thing to know about cellulosic ethanol is that it is relatively high cost. It is at this point not really viable as a commercial proposition, and as a result, the EPA has in fact changed the targets because there was no way they could be met in 2009, 2010. So these are targets, but EPA can change them. But there has been no problem meeting the target for ethanol, for corn-based ethanol, no problem whatsoever. In fact, corn-based ethanol has burgeoned to the point where it's hitting up against the so-called blend wall, the 10% of the US market, where, because at this point, the maximum, up until recently, the maximum amount of ethanol that could be blended into gasoline was 10%. EPA has now changed that in the last year to 15%, but it's not at all clear whether putting 15% ethanol in your car will basically void the warranty and cause other there are ongoing controversies about the 15% ethanol blend. And in fact, it's unlikely to happen unless ethanol, the blenders are protected against tort suits by outraged consumers. So the major feature, and the other point about this is, okay, the major feature here on the subsidy side is the volumetric ethanol excise tax credit for gasoline blenders. Again, it's not an agricultural subsidy. It's a subsidy to the blender of ethanol, to a distributor of gasohol, which blends the gasoline with ethanol. It's a credit against a federal manufacturer's excise tax. And it expires. Okay, and there's also another tax credit, both of which expire at the end of this year. This has then been linked to, historically, 54-cent per gallon secondary tariff on ethanol. This is in trade terms, this is an other duty or charge. It's listed in the U.S. tariff schedule. There has been some question about whether it's consistent with the WTO. I haven't really seen any good arguments that it isn't, simply because it is listed in the U.S. tariff schedule. And of course, these are big subsidies, but they're nothing compared to what the petroleum industry has gotten over the years. So there are also substantial subsidies for cellulosic biofuel. They get a larger credit. Farm bill programs. The Global Subsidies Initiative computed the fuel share of corn subsidies at $450 million in crop year 2007. And of course, the Farm Bill is up for grabs as well. And again, there are an additional layer of state subsidies and state-level mandates. So where are we? Where are we politically? Interestingly enough, we're getting pushback. Pushback number one is from Europe. Europe, there actually was an anti-dumping countervailing duty case in 2009 against U.S. origin biodiesel, which at the time benefited from a loophole in the tax scheme which had in fact created something called splash and dash trade, had in fact greatly stimulated trade, a kind of circumvention loophole. At any rate, the resulting subsidy margins of like at least 29% and some dumping margins as well, which will expire, they sunset in 2014, but not before then. And this has pretty much ended U.S. exports of biodiesel to Europe. And of course, the latest, of course, is that just this week, last week, the EU biofuels industry has again filed a countervailing duty petition against asking for an investigation of the subsidies to the U.S. ethanol industry because of U.S. ethanol exports to Europe. I guess hoping to repeat the past. Pushback number two. Now, in the trade land of yore, of years ago, we all thought, oh my goodness, these agribusiness giants, how will they ever lose their subsidies? They've engineered things perfectly so that the subsidy to the creator of ethanol is just invisible. But the answer is, actually, there's been a lot of criticism. First of all, on the basis that, in fact, ethanol subsidies, the ethanol regime, the renewable fuel standard, results in ethanol use competing for the use of corn and increasing the price of corn and inflating costs for the cattlemen who have no sense of humor, really not much of a sense of humor on this. Food processors, and as well as NGOs who are also critical about this. ICTSD recently did a very good study by Bruce Babcock, which evaluates this at 17% inflation in the price of corn. The cattlemen, for instance, have proposed that the renewable fuel standard be simply adjusted in any year where there's a tight corn supply. So the status of legislation at this point, remember, if the if the VETC is going to be renewed, Congress has to do something. And there has been quite a lot of action, including by EPA, Detroit engine makers, oil companies who don't like the competition. In fact, also the Brazilian ethanol industry. There has been quite a lot of lobbying, including by the Brazilian industry, which has spent, lobbying records show that they spent about $500,000 in the first quarter of 2011. So they're expressing their views. Other interests are spending even more. There's quite a lot of action right now. And this year as well, you have the deficit, you have the super committee, the renewal of this tax credit and of the tariff has disappeared into the super committee process, and heavens knows what will emerge along with the Farm Bill. So, and you have also, someone mentioned Solyndra. Well, there's a company called Range Energy, a cellulosic biofuel producer, which is either bankrupt or just about to go bankrupt and has benefited from DOE loan guarantees. So we're going into that stuff as well. So the last line is, watch Iowa. Why do we have an ethanol mandate? Iowa loves ethanol. Iowa, the corn state, happens to be Iowa, the Iowa caucus state. So Rick Perry is opposed to ethanol. He's on behalf of the cattlemen. Michelle Bachmann has come out against it, against the ethanol mandate. Mitt Romney is sitting on the fence, and I'm sure that the president is in favor. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. When I started researching a bit and asking people, especially in Brazil, about a sustainable energy trade agreement, the first reaction I got was no reaction. It was a very long silence that lasted for days. And then I finally managed to get someone to talk to me from the government in Brazil to talk to me about this. And the first thing that they asked me is to pay attention to IRENA, the, now 31-year-old International Renewable Energy Agency, and note who is not there. And of my mandate, my job here is to talk about the BICS, so Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, and as you can note, 2 of the 4 BICS are not there. In case of Brazil, the explanation is that, IRENA didn't really value the types of renewable energy that Brazil produces mostly, are hydropower and sugarcane ethanol, and therefore there would be no interest for Brazil to be there. I think that this is a situation that could evolve. I believe that both Brazil and China, because of changes that are happening in those countries as far as renewable energy, could, I don't know if join IRENA, but become much more interested in this whole idea of sustainable energy trade agreement than they appear to be today. For Brazil is obviously the notion that to promote trade of high value added products like wind and solar produced by developed countries, although we know that China, supposedly developing country, is also in that game now. But you do that while discriminating against the forms of energy, the renewable energy produced by countries such as Brazil. And this is sort of a mind frame in Brazil, I believe. Well, this is a very dynamic situation now. We know that countries, developing countries or emerging countries are investing a lot in renewable energy of all types. I just saw something that I found interesting from the United Nations Environmental Program. Recent report saying that Brazil, China, and India, developing countries such as those three, invested more in renewable energy than developed countries like the US and UK last year, helping worldwide investment grow by 32% and reach a record of 211 billion last year, 72 billion of those being invested by developing countries. The new total is up to a third from 2009 renewable investments. And the report states that clean energy now is responsible for over 5% of the world's total power production. But for the first time, developing economies overtook developed countries in terms of new investments, spending on utility-scale renewable energy projects, and provisions of equity capital for renewable energy companies. So this is sort of where this is the hopeful story here. China is a leader today in, I believe, both wind and solar. I believe China accounts for 70% of the total of 50 billion put in clean energy projects, primarily in wind power last year. India ranked 8th in the world, growing by 25% to 3.8 billion, with wind projects as the biggest single item at 2.3 billion, followed by 400 million each for solar, biomass, and waste to energy. The situation in South Africa, I apologize, I couldn't get much information about South Africa, but South Africa plays an important role in solar energy, in wind energy in Africa, and has looked at Africa as Africa grows and becomes economically more relevant. South Africa has lots of space to take advantage and make progress there. So South Africa is a country that should be interested in that. In the South area, there are between Brazil, India, South Africa, there are agreements, there are exploratory agreements on cooperation, they are working on very small things in Africa together. Brazil and China cooperation in this field is still at the university level. I don't think there is not anything major in terms of market already. But as far as Brazil is concerned, I would like to, every time you talk about energy in Brazil, you'll see this, okay? You probably have seen this a million times, but I'm showing it to you again. This pizza here. Every official, every businessman, we always show you this, that Brazil is a country that is a leader in the use of renewable energy, and almost half of all energy used in Brazil comes from renewable sources. Obviously, there are different types of renewable sources here with different types of impact. Now, the good story, I think, are good stories coming from all the areas of renewable energy in Brazil, especially on biomass or sugarcane, that area. If you see by the influx of synthetic biology companies from the United States and other countries to Brazil, you can see that something important is taking place in Brazil. It has to do with research of development of second and third generation types of biofuels. You have Ameris already in São Paulo, producing biodiesel from ethanol. You have agreements and joint work done to develop biokerosene for aviation. And this has all to do with the new generations of biofuels. There are where you basically, without growing the space that is occupied by sugarcane plantations. In Brazil, they occupied about of the area in use for agriculture. Sugarcane for ethanol occupies about 3.5%, okay? And occupies about 1.5% of the usable land. But there's lots of room for growth there. But you could produce much more energy and different types of energy and different types of sugar derivatives. And that's what it's, the new term used, without expanding significantly the land use for sugarcane. So this is the hopeful story. This is the important story in Brazil. The second good story is solar. There have been already 3 auctions, electricity auctions in Brazil, where wind has been very, very competitive, without subsidies. Part of the success of the wind energy in Brazil is that major manufacturers of turbines are now producing in Brazil. Brazil is that country that has a market big enough to justify companies like Siemens, like GE, and others to set up shop in Brazil, produce turbines in Brazil. I imagine they see the region as the market, not only Brazil. As you know, wind is there, and that 3.2% could, according to some studies, grow double. But it is important news. It's good news. Same in solar. Now, how to sweeten the deal? I like the expression because it applies very well to Brazil in terms of attracting Brazil to a discussion on an agreement of the kind considered in this discussion. Obviously, there is a very fast way of doing that, which is to dramatically reduce protections and subsidies for corn ethanol in the United States. The moment is ideal for reasons already mentioned. Brazil has become an importer of corn ethanol from the United States. So the threat that was very much present before, that Brazil would inundate the US market with sugarcane ethanol, is not there. The idea is to really create an open market for this product, and the evolution in Brazil over the next, I would say, 10 years for more efficient types of biofuels, cellulosic types of biofuels, I think make a strong case for more cooperation between the 2 largest producers of ethanol. And politically, I believe that this is where is one of the ingredients of a series of movements that should happen in order to attract Brazil to this deal. And finally, as you all know, Brazil has a preference for the WTO format. As sad as the situation is today, well, there is hope that at some point countries, especially all the major countries, will agree that it is the right forum to try again and to maybe someday in the future revive a global trade agreement. This could be obviously a very good point to start that exercise. Although, as I said, I think that the changes that are happening in Brazil, the dynamic in renewable energy that's happening in Brazil, happening in China, happening in India, and the dialogue between those three countries, you should not underestimate. They really consult, they really talk to one another all the time. I think are all, you know, hopeful news in terms of developing a good sustainable energy trade agreement. Thank you.
Okay, now we've got a few minutes, I think, for some comments or questions. You want to kick us off, Bill?
I'd like to ask Shayle Kann whether he agrees with Peter Brun's picture that showed solar being a lot more expensive than wind. And if so, isn't this sort of a simple explanation of why wind is in trouble, or solar is in trouble? And it's basically bumping up against the fact that it's not anywhere near close to competitive with wind, so if you slow down your demand, you're really in trouble. I'm just trying to get the stylized facts. It sounds to me like the stylized fact here is that wind is pretty much made it in terms of competitiveness. Solar is a long ways from competitiveness and still needs a lot of subsidies. Is that the right stylized fact?
Well, I hate all the infighting amongst renewable technologies, but I think there are a couple points that I would make. One is that you have to keep in mind solar at least can generate retail electricity, not just wholesale electricity. So you don't just compare solar up against the cost of generation of a coal plant or a natural gas plant. You can also compare it to the retail cost of electricity to a consumer, which is substantially higher. So the benchmark that solar has to use is a little different because it's scalable down to the distributed level. The other point to make is that solar tends to generate on-peak electricity. It is intermittent, but generally sort of corresponds with demand. Essentially, when the load is high, then solar tends to be good, which means that if you were to take into account peak electricity pricing, solar looks a little bit better relative to wind, which is intermittent and also sometimes generates at night. And the final point I'd make is that I do think solar costs have come down substantially since those numbers were done. And so now you see power purchase agreements in California between solar developers and the utilities in California at less than the referent cost of natural gas, incorporating federal 30% investment tax credit. But even outside of that, solar costs, like I said, are a moving target now and have come down so much that it's getting a lot closer. So I don't think it's right to state that solar has essentially lost the battle. I think solar still has further to go than wind. Undeniably, on a levelized cost of electricity basis, solar tends to be higher still, but that doesn't mean that solar is done maturing, and it doesn't mean that the technology battle is over.
Well, I happen to agree with that statement. I mean, we certainly you can see in the graph that in recent years the cost of solar PV has come down aggressively. I think the point we tried to make is that there's still a potential for bringing down the cost of these two technologies and many other technologies, but it's all about the scale and the global market, and that's going to be increasingly important in the next stage of getting those gains. I would say it's correct that onshore wind at a good site is very competitive, it's very mature technology at the moment, but I mean we happen to believe that we can bring it down further, provided we have that scale in the market and stability.
Yes.
Scott, questions for Shayle and Nathan, and also for Gary. I was just wondering if you could comment on what the natural gas, the shale gas revolution here is meaning for renewable energy going forward, and sort of on a price competitive basis. And I guess for Gary, I mean, I understand you've picked out a small list of what you consider to be doable products for this, but I mean, is that why? Because I know you haven't. When we look at, say, sustainable energy, we look at, there's a whole list of other energies that could be in there. I mean, you could have sort of stuff on CCS or other bits and pieces. I was wondering whether you just made a strategic call not to go down that path because you didn't think it was sort of a feasible route to go at this stage. And I guess the other sort of slightly separate question is, one of the stories I think that I'm reading from this description of taking solar as an example, is it's a sort of an industry which has grown rapidly, based on large-scale government support and subsidies. And I guess there always seems to me to be a slight disjunction, because there's the economic benefits to other countries in a sense of China's subsidies, and then there's the subsidies agreement, which don't necessarily marry up. And when you think about which countries might be party to a SETA, and if, for instance, you don't, at least initially, have, say, a country like China, which from a solar perspective, the world's largest manufacturer, seems to raise the question of what does this mean in terms of, given the trade barriers, or tariff barriers at least, seem to be, from your presentation, low anyway on, say, solar technologies. What are the trade diversion costs, in a sense? I mean, do we run into a situation where, we're losing out in terms of efficiencies and, supply chain issues on the rules of origin end if we don't have these large manufacturers in at the beginning?
Let's take one or two other questions or comments, and then we'll come back to respondents. Yes.
This is just one comment, a little bit outside of the trade discussions. When we talk about the solar and wind, we should always keep in mind Africa, again, as I mentioned before. I mean, 70% of the population has no electricity. Prices are very high, in many countries, and there's a lot of potential investment. I mean, not only private sector, but we are talking about the Green Climate Fund, and other options. So let's keep it also in mind. I mean, the perspective is not so bad, perhaps, as you mentioned before, and it's always to think about that for the future. Thanks.
Okay, last comment, question.
I have a question for Shayle. On your analysis, you were just talking about PV when you talked about current installed capacity and your projections, and I was wondering, given I understand there are about 2 gigawatts of concentrating solar power contracts right now for Southern California and some other developments of concentrating solar, for the broader solar industry, does that significantly change the installed capacity and or the projections for the industry? And then on the subsidy side, I would say that there are a number of solar companies who have said, we're fine with 0 subsidies in the US as long as you get rid of subsidies on the fossil side as well. So go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead.
All right, so I think I have a couple to tackle. The first is on natural gas pricing. I think with regard to solar, there's always two sides to the coin when it comes to natural gas. On the downside, generally when you're comparing solar up against a generation resource, it is natural gas, particularly in the US, because that tends to be the dominant peaking resource. So to the extent that a boom in shale oil results in, or natural gas prices fall through the floor, then your comparative metric for solar is more difficult to reach. On the other hand, and I think more importantly, longer term, solar, being an intermittent resource, needs to be leveled out by a peaking resource. And so solar and natural gas, which is the most logical complement to solar, should actually be very friendly. So I think, in a short-term perspective, falling natural gas prices looks like it will hurt solar, at least relatively speaking. In a long-term perspective, it's a good thing. And then on the concentrating solar point, if you look, concentrating solar was kind of the golden child of solar for a while, and there were a lot of power purchase agreements signed up in California from about 2005 to 2007, 2008, And then when the global financial crisis hit and Spain removed its incentive and the price for solar feedstock fell through the floor, which all happened at the same time in late 2008, early 2009, suddenly PV looked a lot more attractive. And so the overarching trend has been, for the past couple of years, some concentrating solar projects continuing to get built out, but a number of them also switching technologies from CSP to PV. And that trend continues. So I think there is an installed base of concentrating solar. A lot of it was actually built back in the early 80s. And there's going to be a few more very large projects that are moving forward now. But if you're looking forward, there are very few new contracts for concentrating solar getting signed up now. And it's kind of hard to envision a scenario in which concentrating solar retakes the lead anytime in the next few years.
Any other panelists want to comment? Gary?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. First of all, the question about, starting small and possibly getting stuck there, that is certainly a possibility, because if one looks at trade agreements which had kind of an apparently open-ended accession clause, those have not been used very much. NAFTA clearly has not been used, but even the EU negotiates each new member kind of separately. There's no kind of automatic accession. So the history is along the lines of this fear that if you don't, well, what you start with is what you end up with 10 years later. I was hoping to address that by kind of a unanimous rule on expanding both membership and subjects, but maybe that doesn't work, and I take the caution. Now, from the discussion we've just had and what Paulo and Amy have said, I guess I would now elevate Brazil into a very likely early member along with China if ethanol and biomass are part of the story. I mean, as Paulo said, this may be the golden moment to do it, but with the fiscal politics in this country and the price of sugarcane and so forth, it might just go through, especially if we had a president who was more ambitious on trade agreements than the one we have now. But who can tell? Maybe next year we'll see new energy on this field, and this could be then a time to talk about it. And I think what would also make it possible is something that Ethan mentioned earlier, which I didn't emphasize. If we had a rule when we talk about subsidies that we're going to ignore historical subsidies, this is still a somewhat open area in U.S. CVD law, which is forever evolving. But if you had an agreement that subsidies in the past will not be counted in future CVD cases, that would open the door then for probably more membership across a range of issues, including would deal with past U.S. corn subsidies and so forth, which were very, very large. So that would make it more possible for more subjects. In terms of trade diversion, I think the big issue, most immediate, would be local content requirements. If you have an agreement where local content requirements are only relaxed for members of the agreement, which is the GPA model, yeah, there will be a lot of diversion, because the countries which don't join, they will be subject to local content requirements just as they are now on government procurement. So that's where you would get the big trade diversion. But I guess my view on trade diversion is not as purist as, let's say, Jagdish Bhagwati by a long shot. I think trade diversion, or the threat of it, is a very good way to enlarge agreements. So it doesn't bother me so much, but it's certainly there.
Okay, a quick comment, and then we'll move to lunch. Ricardo.
No, just a quick comment following up on that. I think that from the previous presentations, and particularly Amy's and Paulo, it's clear that including biofuels will then attract not only perhaps Brazil, but a number of other producers, for instance, in Africa, where right now capacity is being generated. So we have been looking at investment patterns in the production of biofuels and where this is going, and it's very interesting from that perspective. So again, just to make that point, that this will open the tent to others to find something like this SETA attractive.
Okay, thanks to all of the presenters, and thanks to all of you for the comments and questions.